What if an innocent housewarming party turned into a nightmare that unraveled a horrifying mystery? On a cold autumn evening in the quiet town of Greenfield, a sudden disappearance left the community questioning everything they thought they knew about their neighbors. Greenfield was the epitome of small-town charm. The streets were lined with maple trees. Kids rode their bikes until sunset, and doors were rarely locked. The kind of town where people said nothing bad ever happened. But on the night of the 15th of October, that fragile sense of safety would be shattered forever. The Parker family had just moved into their dream home on Maple Lane, a beautiful colonial-style house with a sprawling backyard. Excited to introduce themselves to the neighborhood, they hosted a housewarming party, inviting everyone from the street and beyond. The evening was lively. Neighbors exchanged stories, music played softly in the background, and children chased each other across the lawn. Among the guests was 26-year-old Emma Clarke, a beloved teacher at Greenfield Elementary. Emma wasn't just well-known in town, she was cherished. With her infectious laughter and warm demeanor, she had a way of making everyone feel special. That night, Emma wore her signature smile, mingling with old friends and making new ones. As the evening stretched on, conversations flowed, and the party seemed to be a success. Emma excused herself from a group of friends around 9:30 p.m., saying she needed to take a quick phone call. She stepped into the backyard, illuminated by the soft glow of string lights that the Parkers had carefully hung. A few people saw her standing near the edge of the yard, speaking animatedly on her phone. But after that, she seemed to vanish into thin air. Initially, no one noticed her absence. The party continued, and people assumed she had either left early or gone inside. But when Emma didn't return to her group of friends, concern began to grow. By 10:30 p.m., people were asking if anyone had seen her. A quick check of the house turned up nothing. No Emma. Her car was still parked in the driveway, her keys were nowhere to be found, and calls to her phone went straight to voicemail. Panic began to spread through the gathering. Guests spilled into the backyard with flashlights calling Emma's name. Others walked up and down Maple Lane, hoping she'd simply wandered off or gone for a walk. The cheerful atmosphere of the party had dissolved into a tense and frantic search. Emma was nowhere to be found. By midnight, the police were called. Officers arrived and questioned the guests, trying to piece together a timeline of events. Who had seen her last? Was there anyone at the party who didn't belong? The answers were unsettlingly vague. Some said they thought they saw her walking toward the woods behind the Parkers' property, but no one could confirm it for sure. The wooded area, a dense and shadowy expanse rarely ventured into, became the focal point of the search. Despite their best efforts, neither the neighbors nor the police found any trace of Emma that night. Her disappearance was as puzzling as it was alarming. Greenfield was not the kind of place where people went missing. It was a town where everyone looked out for each other, where trouble seemed like a distant threat. But now, the unthinkable had happened. The next morning, the search continued. Flyers bearing Emma's smiling face were posted around town. Local news channels picked up the story, and the once quiet Greenfield became the center of attention. Friends and family gathered at the Parkers' home, desperate for answers. Rumors began to swirl. Some whispered about a stranger seen lurking near the party, while others speculated that someone in the neighborhood knew more than they were letting on. But beneath the speculation lay a terrifying question. How could someone disappear without a single trace in a town where everyone knew everyone? The morning after Emma Clarke's disappearance, Greenfield was unrecognizable. What had once been a peaceful, almost idyllic town, where everyone knew each other by name, now felt like a place of dread. The usual humdrum of small-town life had been replaced by the frantic activity of law enforcement and concerned residents. Patrol cars lined Maple Lane, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the otherwise quiet neighborhood. In the distance, search teams fanned out through the dense woods behind the Parkers' property, combing through every inch of the forest in hopes of finding any trace of Emma. The sight of the flyers, posted on every lamppost, bulletin board, and storefront, hit everyone like a punch to the gut. Each flyer bore Emma's face, a radiant smile frozen in time, forever juxtaposed against the unknown horror she had encountered the night before. It wasn't just the town that had changed, it was the residents, too. Friends, family, and strangers alike gathered at the community center, ready to help, but no one knew what they were truly looking for. There was no body, no clue, no sense of where Emma might have gone or what had happened to her. Detective Mark Wallace stood by the Parkers' front door that morning, watching the scene unfold. Wallace wasn't just any detective had grown up in Greenfield. He knew the town's rhythms, its residents, and its secrets. Wallace was a seasoned investigator, having solved cases that seemed impossible in the past. But this one gnawed at him. Standing in the Parkers' backyard, scanning the woods where Emma had vanished, he could feel the weight of the case pressing down on him. The forest seemed too quiet, too still, as if it was hiding something. It was a feeling Wallace couldn't shake. The first step in the investigation was to piece together Emma's movements from the previous evening. Witness statements were gathered from every guest at the party. The guests were all well-meaning, but their memories seemed vague. Most described Emma as being cheerful and social, mingling with everyone like the beloved teacher she was. No one could recall any odd behavior, no signs of distress. A few had mentioned seeing her step outside to take a phone call, but no one had thought much of it at the time. It was then that one guest, a local businessman named Frank Nelson, spoke up. Frank was a quiet man who rarely participated in social events, but he had been present at the party with his wife. He told the investigators that he had seen a shadowy figure near the edge of the woods as he was returning from the bathroom. At first, he thought it was just someone lingering in the dark, but as he got closer, he realized that the figure seemed to be watching the party, not interacting with anyone. Frank had assumed it was one of the guests sneaking off for a moment of solitude, but something about the figure unsettled him. It was the way it stood, still and motionless, just out of sight of the party. He hadn't said anything to anyone at the time, dismissing it as his imagination playing tricks on him. But now, he couldn't ignore the possibility that whoever or whatever that figure was, it might have had something to do with Emma's disappearance. Detective Wallace's brow furrowed as he listened to Frank's account. He wasn't quick to jump to conclusions, but the idea that someone had been watching the party without joining in made his instincts flare. Was this an accident, or had Emma been targeted? With the witness statements in hand, Wallace ordered a search of the woods. The forest behind the Parkers' house was dense and dark, even in daylight. The trees seemed to form a thick barrier, blocking out the light and casting the area in shadows. It was the kind of place where things could easily be hidden and people could disappear without anyone noticing. The search teams spread out in a grid pattern, carefully scouring the ground for any signs of Emma. The air was cold and damp, a chill that seemed to creep into their bones as they trudged through the thick underbrush. The ground was soft from the previous night's rain, leaving footprints easily visible if anyone had walked through the area recently. Hours passed with little to show for the effort. Wallace knew that this was the most critical time for finding something that could lead them to Emma. The investigators combed through every inch of the woods, retracing their steps, looking for signs of a struggle, broken branches, or anything out of the ordinary. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that the search dogs finally picked up a scent. The dogs barked excitedly, pulling toward a trail that led deeper into the forest. Wallace's heart raced as they followed the dogs, hoping that this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. But after a mile or so, the dogs came to a halt. Their handlers called them back, confused. The trail had simply disappeared. It was as though Emma had vanished into thin air. Back at the Parkers' house, Wallace and his team began examining the backyard more closely. They found something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. A patch of disturbed soil near the edge of the yard, right where Emma had been seen last. The soil was loose, as though something or someone had been there recently. It didn't take long for the investigators to discover a single footprint, partially obscured by the leaves. The footprint didn't match any of the guests' shoes. This was the first real clue that someone else might have been involved. Who had left this mark? Why hadn't anyone seen them? And what did this mean for the case? Inside the house, another breakthrough came from Emma's phone records. Her last call, made at 9:31 p.m., had been to an unknown number. The phone was never found, but the call details raised even more questions. Attempts to trace the number led to a dead end. The phone was unregistered. A burner phone. Whoever had been in contact with Emma had gone to great lengths to keep their identity hidden. This only deepened the mystery. Who had Emma been speaking to? Why hadn't she mentioned the call to anyone at the party? Was this person connected to her disappearance in some way? Theories began to circulate among the investigators. Some believed Emma had been lured away by someone she knew, a friend or acquaintance who had manipulated her into leaving the safety of the party. Others feared that a stranger had been lurking in the town, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Wallace couldn't help but wonder if the answer wasn't out there in the town, but within it. Greenfield was a small town. Everyone knew everyone. Beneath the well-manicured lawns and perfect facades, there were old rivalries, grudges, and hidden resentments. Could someone in town be hiding something? Could they be involved in Emma's disappearance? By the time the sun began to set, the investigation had stalled. No new leads had emerged. The search teams had combed through the woods. The phone records had yielded no answers, and Emma's car remained parked in the driveway, untouched. Frustration and exhaustion were beginning to take their toll on the investigators. But Detective Wallace wasn't ready to give up. He knew that cases like this were rarely solved on the first day, that sometimes the breakthrough came when you least expected it. The answer, he believed, was out there. They just had to find it. As night fell over Greenfield, the town that once felt so safe now seemed filled with a sense of unease. Parents kept their children close, and the usual sounds of the evening were replaced by whispers and nervous glances. Everyone had begun to wonder the same thing. What happened to Emma Clarke? One thing was certain, though. This case was far from over. The truth was out there waiting to be uncovered. The investigation had only just begun, but as days passed, the pressure on Detective Mark Wallace grew heavier. Each hour without a breakthrough felt like a weight on his shoulders, and every attempt to follow a lead seemed to fade into nothing. Greenfield was still in shock, its tight-knit community now left grappling with questions they didn't have answers to. The disappearance of Emma Clarke had shaken everyone to their core, and with each passing day, the fear among the residents grew stronger. Despite the mounting frustration, Wallace knew that they couldn't afford to lose focus. He gathered his team for a meeting, hoping to regroup and reassess their approach. They needed to look at things from a different angle, anything that could lead them to Emma. It was time to look closer at the people closest to her. The Parkers, Emma's longtime friends, were understandably devastated by the disappearance of their guest. After all, Emma had been an integral part of their lives for years. But as Wallace dug deeper, he started noticing things that didn't sit right, small details that seemed to slip under the radar. The Parkers' son, 17-year-old Ben, had been present at the party. A typical teenager, Ben was quiet, introverted, and didn't show much emotion during the investigation. But there was one thing Wallace found odd. The boy had seemed unusually composed, almost too calm. It wasn't the frantic, anxious behavior one might expect from a teenager whose close family friend had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. Ben had been the last one to see Emma, aside from the person on the other end of the mysterious phone call. He had been chatting with her on the porch just moments before she stepped outside. According to him, she had been in a hurry, leaving without a word to anyone. But Wallace noticed that his story seemed to shift slightly with each retelling. At first, Ben had claimed Emma was heading back inside the house when he last saw her, but then he mentioned she had gone to the backyard to answer a call. These inconsistencies raised Wallace's suspicions. While there was nothing overtly sinister in Ben's behavior, the detective couldn't ignore the possibility that the teenager knew more than he was letting on. Wallace decided to dig into Ben's past. After all, every lead was worth exploring. It wasn't long before a few things began to surface. Ben had been hanging out with a group of friends from school who had a history of trouble with the law. They weren't criminals, but some of their activities, like petty theft and vandalism, had raised eyebrows. It seemed that Ben had become involved with the wrong crowd in recent months, and Wallace couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about the boys' connections that might be more than just coincidence. Another key detail was Emma's behavior in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Wallace had received reports from colleagues in the local school system that Emma had been increasingly distant, her once vibrant demeanor now tinged with a sense of unease. She had been dealing with personal issues, but no one could figure out exactly what was troubling her. As Wallace pieced together the information, one thing became clear. The last few weeks of Emma's life had been filled with unresolved tension. There were whispers among the students that she had been involved in some sort of affair with a married man, but no one could confirm the rumor. There were also reports that Emma had been having conflicts with her closest friends, though the details were vague. Had these issues led to her disappearance? Was someone close to her trying to silence her? Meanwhile, the search for Emma continued. Wallace had been following up on every lead, but nothing had panned out. The woods had been scoured, the phone records analyzed, and every guest at the party had been questioned. Yet every new piece of information only seemed to raise more questions. And now the detective had to consider a terrifying possibility. What if Emma had been kidnapped? The idea of a random kidnapping in Greenfield was nearly unthinkable. The town was small, peaceful, and crime was almost non-existent. But the more Wallace thought about it, the more it seemed plausible. Someone had taken Emma, and whoever it was, they were playing a game of cat and mouse. Each lead Wallace followed seemed to evaporate just when he thought he was getting closer. But then, something changed. Late one night, as Wallace sat at his desk reviewing the case files, he received a call that would alter the course of the investigation. The voice on the other end was muffled, distorted, as if someone was speaking through a mask. "I have her." The chilling words sent a jolt of adrenaline through Wallace. The voice on the phone wasn't threatening. It wasn't demanding anything, at least not yet. It was cold and devoid of any emotion. The line went dead almost as soon as the words had been spoken. Wallace's mind raced. Who was this? Was it Emma's abductor? Or was it someone with information about her whereabouts? The next few hours were filled with urgency. Wallace ordered a trace on the call, but the number was once again untraceable, just like the one from Emma's last phone call. Whoever was behind this had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. As Wallace thought through the implications of the call, he couldn't help but wonder if it had been a test, a way of toying with him. If the person behind this truly had Emma, why hadn't they made any demands? Why leave a cryptic message instead of making a clear threat? Wallace's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at his door. One of his colleagues, Officer Jenny Hall, entered, holding a thick file in her hand. "Detective, we got something," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and caution. Wallace stood and took the file from her, flipping it open. Inside was a series of surveillance photos from a nearby convenience store. The photos were blurry, but they showed a figure entering the store just hours after Emma had gone missing. The figure was wearing a large hood, their face obscured. But what caught Wallace's attention was the bag. They were carrying something that looked eerily familiar. It was Emma's purse. The implications of this discovery were huge. The figure in the store was someone who had been in direct contact with Emma. Whoever had taken her had been at least one step ahead of the investigation. And now, they had a new lead. Wallace turned to Officer Hall. "Get the footage from the cameras. We need to know who that person Eisen fast." The game had changed. The clock was ticking, and the detective's instincts told him that Emma's life was hanging in the balance. As the hours ticked by, the urgency of the situation became unbearable. Detective Mark Wallace couldn't shake the feeling that every moment wasted was a moment too late for Emma Clarke. The discovery of her purse in the convenience store had reignited the fire of the investigation, but it had also added more complexity. The person seen in the store wasn't just a stranger, they were someone close enough to Emma to have access to her belongings. Wallace's mind raced. Who was this person? Why had they left the purse behind? And why hadn't they contacted the authorities? The more he thought about it, the more questions surfaced, and each one felt like a new dead end. The surveillance footage from the convenience store wasn't as clear as they had hoped. The figure in the video was too far away to make out any distinguishing features. They had their back turned, and the bag was the only item that was clear enough to link them to the case. Still, it was something more than they had before. Wallace couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment he had been waiting for. Was this the breakthrough they needed to finally track down Emma and bring her home? Or was it just another dead end, a cruel trick that would lead them further away from the truth? A few hours later, Officer Hall returned to Wallace's office, her face grim. "We've found something," she said, placing a folder on the desk in front of him. "It's not much, but it's a start." Wallace flipped open the folder, scanning the contents quickly. Inside was a name that stopped him in his tracks: Ryan Halloran. Ryan Halloran. The name wasn't familiar at first, but as Wallace looked closer, memories of old cases began to resurface. Halloran had been involved in a few minor offenses in the past: petty theft, some assault charges, but nothing serious enough to raise any red flags. He was a local from a nearby town, but he had no clear connection to Emma. Until now, Halloran had been seen leaving the convenience store the night Emma's purse was found. The timeline matched. "That's our guy," Wallace muttered under his breath. But as soon as he said it, he felt a pang of doubt. Was it really that simple? Was Halloran the person who had taken Emma, or was he just another pawn in a much larger game? Wallace had seen enough in his career to know that things were rarely as they seemed. His instincts told him to dig deeper. There was more to this story, and it wasn't going to be easy to uncover. The next step was clear. They needed to track down Ryan Halloran and see what he knew. By the time they located his apartment, it was already dark. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the pavement. Wallace and Hall were flanked by two other officers, all of them ready for whatever they might find. They knocked on Halloran's door, and after a long pause, a muffled voice called out from inside. "Who is it?" "We're with the police," Wallace replied, his voice firm but calm. "We need to speak with you about Emma Clarke." There was a long silence. Then the door creaked open, and Halloran stepped into view. He was a lanky man in his late 20s, his eyes bloodshot and tired. His clothes were disheveled, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Wallace's first impression of him was one of unease. Halloran didn't look like someone who had been involved in a kidnapping or anything remotely violent. But there was something off about Hema's nervous energy that radiated from his every movement. "Is there a problem?" Halloran asked, his voice shaky. "We have reason to believe you might know something about Emma Clarke's disappearance," Wallace said, keeping his tone even. "We found her purse at a convenience store, and we believe you were there." Halloran's eyes darted nervously as he stepped back, glancing around the hallway before looking down at the floor. "I don't know anything about that," he stammered. "I didn't take anything from her." Wallace's gaze hardened. "I am not asking if you took something from her. I am asking if you know where she is." Halloran swallowed hard, his lips trembling. Don't know. I swear." Wallace wasn't convinced. "We need to come inside, Ryan." Reluctantly, Halloran stepped aside, allowing Wallace and the others to enter. As they moved through the small apartment, Wallace's eyes scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. There was nothing particularly unusual, just a typical bachelor pad with cluttered furniture, empty beer cans, and some unwashed dishes. Wallace's eyes narrowed as he spotted something on the coffee table. A receipt from a local hardware store. It was dated the same night Emma had gone missing. "Ryan," Wallace said, holding up the receipt. What's this? Halloran's face went pale as he glanced down at the paper. It's nothing, he muttered. Just some stuff I needed for my car. But Wallace wasn't buying it. You are going to need to do better than that. With no other choice, Halloran sat down on the couch, his hands shaking. Look, I didn't hurt Emma. I swear. But I know someone who might have. The words hung in the air for a moment, thick with tension. Wallace leaned forward, his voice low and steady. Who? Tell me everything. Halloran hesitated, his face twitching as he seemed to weigh his options. Finally, he spoke. I didn't take her, but I know who did, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was Ben Parker. He's the one who... But before he could finish, there was a loud bang on the door, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Police! Get on the ground! In an instant, the room was flooded with officers. Ben Parker had been caught. His arrest sent shockwaves through Greenfield, a town that had once seemed untouched by crime, now caught in the midst of a nightmare. Detective Mark Wallace, his team, and the entire community were reeling from the revelation that Benoni of their own had been involved in Emma Clarke's disappearance. But as Ben was led out of his home in handcuffs, Wallace couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Ben was young, just a teenager, and the details didn't seem to add up. Sure, he had been caught in a lie, but something about his demeanor didn't feel right. There was no rage or resistance, just a blank stare, like a person who had already resigned themselves to their fate. Was he guilty, or was there something bigger at play here? Wallace needed answers and fast. The interrogation room was cold, the harsh light above casting long shadows across Ben's face as he sat slumped in the chair. His eyes were swollen from lack of sleep, and his hands were trembling. It was clear that the shock of being arrested had finally caught up with him. You know why you are here, Ben, Wallace began, his voice steady but firm. You are not just a witness anymore. We have reason to believe you were involved in Emma Clarke's disappearance. Ben's lips quivered, but he didn't speak. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Wallace leaned in, his eyes narrowing. We know you lied about seeing Emma that night. You told us she went to the backyard to answer a call, but that doesn't match the evidence. We know you were the last one to see her alive. Ben's shoulders tensed at the mention of Emma's name. Wallace pressed on. Did you hurt her, Ben? Did you take her? For a long moment, Ben didn't respond. His eyes darted around the room, his fingers twitching as if he was trying to decide whether to speak. Finally, his voice broke the silence, a whisper barely audible. I didn't mean to, he muttered. I didn't mean to hurt her. Wallace's heart sank. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. The truth was about to come out. What happened, Ben? Wallace asked, his voice softening. Tell me everything. Ben took a deep breath, wiping his face with his sleeve before he began to speak. His words were halting at first, as if he were afraid of what he might reveal. But as the minutes passed, the truth began to pour out. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Ben began, his voice cracking. I didn't want to hurt her. I just got so angry. She didn't want to be with me. She was seeing someone else. She was going to leave, and I couldn't let her. I thought if I just talked to her, maybe I could change her mind. But she didn't listen. Ben's eyes welled with tears as he spoke, his guilt and fear evident in every word. She pushed me away, and I lost control. I didn't mean to hurt her, I swear, but I did. And then I panicked. Wallace sat back in his chair, processing what he had just heard. It was a confession, a twisted, tragic one, but a confession nonetheless. Ben Parker had been in love with Emma Clarke, but when she tried to break free from their relationship, he snapped. In his mind, he had believed he could make her stay, but it all spiraled out of control. So, you kidnapped her? Wallace asked. Where is she, Ben? Ben shook his head, his face contorting in anguish. Didn't mean to take her. I just wanted to make her listen. But then I couldn't think straight. I didn't know what to do. His voice faltered, and he broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Wallace leaned forward, trying to calm him. Where is she, Ben? Where did you take her? Ben looked up, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't take her anywhere. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just left her there, in the woods. I was too scared to go back. I thought she was gone, and I couldn't fix it. The room fell into silence as Wallace absorbed Ben's confession. The teen had been driven by obsession and a desperate need for control, and in his emotional breakdown he had led them to Emma. With the confession in hand, Wallace immediately ordered a search of the woods where Ben claimed to have left Emma. Time was of the essence, every second counted. The search teams worked tirelessly throughout the night, combing the dense forest. The early morning light broke over the horizon, casting an eerie glow on the forest floor. Officers scoured the area methodically, their boots crunching on the fallen leaves. Wallace and his team followed the trail, their eyes sharp for any signs of Emma. Time was running out. Would they find her before it was too late? And then, just before dawn, a breakthrough. One of the officers, Sarah Green, found something set of footprints leading off the trail. They were faint but unmistakable, and they led to a clearing. The search party quickly moved toward the clearing, their hearts pounding in anticipation. The clearing was small but surrounded by trees that offered a dense canopy, making it easy to overlook. There, under a cluster of trees, they found her, Emma Clarke, alive but unconscious. The sight of Emma, battered but breathing, brought a rush of emotions for Wallace. She had been left there for hours, vulnerable to the elements and deprived of water. She was pale, her clothes tattered, and her face bruised, but she was alive. As Emma was gently lifted onto a stretcher, Wallace felt the weight of the case finally begin to lift from his shoulders. The nightmare had ended, but it wasn't without scars. "Is she going to be okay?" Officer Green asked, her voice trembling. "She will be," Wallace said quietly. But even as he spoke, he knew the mental toll would be far greater than any physical injury. Emma had been through hell, and it would take time to heal. As Emma was rushed to the hospital for treatment, Wallace reflected on everything that had led to this moment. There were no happy endings in this case, no real sense of justice. Emma would recover, but the scars from this ordeal would last forever. And Ben Hay would face the consequences of his actions, but the damage was done. Back at the station, the officers worked tirelessly to wrap up the investigation. Ben Parker was charged with kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. His trial would be a long and grueling process, but it was clear that the psychological damage done to both him and Emma would reverberate long after the case had been closed. Wallace sat at his desk, staring at the case files in front of him. There was a bittersweet satisfaction in knowing that Emma was safe, but it was marred by the realization of how easily everything could have gone wrong, how a simple relationship turned dark and destructive. He had done his job, but it had come at a cost.